All right, well, good morning, everyone. My name is Shewmake. I'm a PhD student at UC Berkeley, working in the Redwood Center for Theoretical Neuroscience. And I'm very excited to get to chair today's panel on new landscapes in AI research, and in AI, rather, generally. And of course, a longtime fan of thinking about thinking. So yeah, the goal of today, of course, the stated goal of the summit is on fundamental challenges in AI. And of course, that includes the technical components of formal problems in AI and methods for constructing algorithms, for example. But it also lives in an environment, in an ecosystem, which itself has been evolving for the last century, let's say, of how this kind of work is funded, how it's organized, and how people flow through this kind of system. So we believe it's important to recognize that context when we think about the future directions of AI and what course we're on. So in particular, I think one of the most significant effects, which Rory pointed out at the beginning, was this dramatic increase in private funding and private interest in AI, which means that in terms of research direction, now there's a plurality of agents with their own incentives and their own constructions of what intelligence means or what a useful notion of intelligence may be, which means we are now encountering another alignment problem, rather a misalignment problem between academia and its pursuit of the fundamental nature of intelligence and the market's construal of intelligence in terms of economic utility. So a major challenge then in our field is to balance these long-term, open-ended scientific questions with pressures of commercialization. So each of our panelists is participating in this ecosystem and reshaping these incentive structures through increasingly novel organizational designs. So quickly, I'll go through and introduce each of the panelists, and then I'll give them a chance to chat about themselves. So we're very fortunate to be joined, of course, by Professor J. McClelland, which you heard of before, professor at Stanford. We have the PDP book always on the desk in Redwood Center, so we point to you often. So next we have Sam Rodriques, who has launched Future House very recently, a new research moonshot in San Francisco. Sam holds a PhD in physics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. We have Dr. John Whaley, is that right? Whaley, who's the founder of Redcoat AI and also started Inception Studio, which is a nonprofit accelerator for AI native founders. He's also an adjunct lecturer in computer science at Stanford University in generative AI and received his PhD in computer science from Stanford. Finally, we also have Anastasia Gamick. Gamick, is that right? OK, great. Anastasia is the co-founder and COO of Convergent Research, where she is pioneering new models for funding basic science research and applied science research through this mechanism called focused research organizations. Her background is in linguistics and computer science. And then finally, we have Scott Phoenix. Scott is currently a partner at 50 Years, a deep tech pre-seed and seed stage VC firm. And before that, Scott was co-founder and CEO of Vicarious, an AGI and robotics startup recently acquired by Alphabet. OK, so the goal here really is to give each of you the opportunity to share the philosophy underlying your work, how you view the current ecosystem and how that's changed over time, and how that relates to organizational structure. And of course, what challenges you see as open problems in the sort of social engineering of intelligence and its study. So we'll just go on down the line, and I'll ask each of you to introduce yourself and comment on your philosophy, what you're up to, and so on.
Sure.
Scott, yeah.
Sure, I'll open. OK, so back when I started Vicarious, I used to give a little spiel about how the reason we had deep learning and the reason we had the AI ecosystem using GPUs and kind of the state we have now is kind of like a version of the Whorf hypothesis, but as applied to the institutions that we have equals the algorithms that we get. And so the reason that a deep learning system is 10 lines of code is because the paper you publish at NIPS is 3 pages long or something. And so all of these data sets and institutions come to shape the algorithms that we get and the search space for intelligence. And what if AI is actually outside of the institutional search space we've created for ourselves? That would be a really big problem and a really big bottleneck to us making progress. And I think the good news for us is that it happens so far to seem like it fits reasonably well into the intersection of the existing institutions and also commercial interests. Thought is a very valuable thing that people have paid a lot of money for. And so far anyway, it seems like there's relatively good alignment. I would say if you were to give me a wish list of, OK, what's the one thing you would change? The biggest thing I would change is that I think many, if not most, very high potential people choose quests that are too small to matter. Whenever I see the list of startups coming out of Y Combinator every 6 months, I feel a little sadness because it's like humanity's best and brightest oftentimes. Many, many really brilliant, very ambitious, very hardworking people choosing to work on a waiting room assistant for dentist's office or something. It's something that's important, but not civilizationally important. And I think the thing that I most want to change through our work at 50 Years and the programs that we run is to help people who have the potential for doing something that's civilizationally impactful to get the operating system in place, the network, the knowledge, and the skills in order to actually reach for their biggest gift they could give to Team Human.
That's great. Yeah. So I'm John Whaley. I did my PhD at Stanford, as you mentioned, and I last quarter I taught a class about building applications on large language models. I think we capped the enrollment at 70, and I think it filled up faster than any other class I've ever seen at Stanford. Within 3 minutes, it was full. And I also run this nonprofit accelerator called Inception Studio. So I see a lot of kind of early stage people who are trying to figure out like what things that they can do with large language models and generative AI. I am both bullish on this area as well as skeptical. I think that there is a whole lot of hype and there's a lot of information which is like not really conducive to kind of having reasoned discourse around kind of generative AI. That being said, I think there's also some massive opportunities that kind of will really kind of exposed and unlocked, just from the innovations that have happened over the last 1 to 3 years. And I mean I think one of the biggest challenges you have is that there certainly is a question of just because you can build a system doesn't mean you necessarily should, if this is going to be kind of like good for society, good for humanity, like these sorts of things. Yet the kind of incentive structures are a little bit weird, like just in terms of like, and in terms of like what people are trying to build or kind of like enticed to end up building. And I think that there's room for some type of like reasoned discourse about, well, what are kind of the reasonable, like some of these systems that you can build can end up being actually harmful in various ways. And I'm not really talking about like, oh my God, the AGI killer robots are going to come and kill everyone, but it's more like, well, in the hands of bad people, then some of these tools and capabilities can end up just causing real harms. And but just having some kind of like reasonable like understanding about like what should be those limitations, where at the same time there's like huge promise on the other side in terms of what capabilities that they have. And I think so far, a lot of the conversation has been kind of geared more towards like doomsday scenarios of like the AGI superhuman intelligence coming and eradicating humanity and things like that. That is not, it's just sucking all the oxygen out of the room, out of like the real potential harms, like the ones that can actually happen, afforded by people being able to do like deep fakes at a large scale, or influence elections, or distribute propaganda in kind of new ways and things like that. These are all like things that could be real practical harms that could happen in the near term. And so I think there's, so that's what I think is one of the big fundamental challenges, balancing between, progress, where kind of, and then what type of, thoughtful controls that we might want to have, on these systems as we go forward.
So, I am going to try to be really brief right now, but I did want to just say that my fundamental goal remains the goal of understanding the biological or the natural solution to creating, truly intelligent contributions to culture and society. I feel that this is actually a a goal, a task that's being pursued by many of my long-term friends and colleagues in neuroscience in particular, and to some degree in cognitive science. But it's potentially very drastically overshadowed by the feeling that the fundamental challenges we face are ones of building artificial systems rather than understanding, the natural solution that evolution has produced. Of course, artificial systems are powerful and useful, and they're subject to all these potential bad actor uses and so on, and those things are important. But I myself got involved with DeepMind, which is about artificial intelligence fundamentally, and was acquired by Google, which is certainly interested in, solving problems in managing information for the world. But why did I do that then? What was the motivation that I had? Well, the motivation was that in 2015, when I first interacted with folks at the very small little, excited little group of people who were working together in this small building near the King's Cross railway station, there was this fascination with fundamental questions about the nature of our own thought processes and how they could be captured by these systems. And I have felt that Jeff Hinton's sort of noticing that, figuring out how to do gradient descent to learn the connection weights and find out what these natural solutions could be like was a very important contributor to my ability to understand human cognition. And so you might think of me as almost a leech, who's gone to people who are thinking about AI and trying to suck insights out of what they're doing for the sake of understanding the human or biological brain, ultimately. And so just want to have that out there on the table. I think they think that maybe my perspective is of some value to them because people like my managers say, oh, it's always good to have a neuroscientist in the room, when we're thinking about these things. So we bring something to the table for those thoughts, but at the same time, people have different goals, and my goals remain to understand the natural solution and to encourage us to build bridges that allow for balanced exploration of these two kinds of research, right? The more basic academic science of discovering these natural solutions and interfacing with neuroscience research to learn more about how the brain really solves these problems, and bringing that together with this other kind of research, which has the potential to overwhelm those other kinds of explorations.
Cool. So I co-founded a nonprofit called Convergent Research, where we are launching a series of focused research organizations. So we're very much so on the institutional and innovation, and incentive design side. So our theory is that there are a series of problems that have a certain shape. They're long-term problems. They need coordinated efforts between multidisciplinary areas. They have a medium-sized budget. And they really need a single direction and a leader pushing them in this way. These types of problems are not incentivized in academia because you need a certain dollar-to-paper ratio. You need to incentivize your grad students to publish and then move on. You need to generate funding for your next grant cycle. They're not incentivized in for-profit settings because they're often public goods. You're just not going to capture the value from these projects. Examples very relevant to this space are things like AlphaFold. I would think of as a focused research organization style project where they had a specific team working towards technical milestones that was isolated from the rest of the organization, really pushing forward. We have projects like Lean, which is an open source language for math, which will be really interesting for formal verification, automated theorem proving. On the neuroscience side, we're doing a connectomics project, which is trying to map like molecular size connections across the whole brain. These are all projects that just are not incentivized in our current models. And so we're working with scientists and founders and funders to spin up whole organizations targeted only on these projects. It's been really interesting for a couple of reasons. One is that we go to scientists and we're like, hey, what would you do with $50 million to fundamentally unbottleneck your field? And they say, more money for my lab. And I'm like, okay, that's cool. But what would you do if you really kind of like didn't have to help your grad students finish their thesis? If you didn't have to participate in the next funding cycle, what would you do with a large amount of money and time? And they say, more money for my lab. And I'm like, okay, great. And they walk away. And the real problem is that they haven't been noodling this. They haven't been thinking through what are the fundamental problems and how could I solve them. And so they'll come back a week, a month, 2 months later with like, hey, actually, there's this data set that we could generate that would change the way we're approaching this problem, and I can't do it in my lab, but if I could fund it, I would fund it, and it would unbottleneck research. And so we're launching a series of these organizations, and I think that there are real overlaps between AI, but also lots of other areas of science.
Yeah, so I'm Sam. So I run FutureHouse, which is a nonprofit research lab in San Francisco focused on automating science. So we're trying to automate the entire process of discovery research, mostly to enable us to understand systems that are too complicated for humans to reason about effectively. So for example, there are 20,000 genes in the human genome. And if you want to create like a whole model of like how the cell works, you need to have some knowledge about how each of those genes works. And there is, in fact, literature for almost all of them. But you don't have enough time in your life to go and like get up to date on the literature for all of them. And so these are the kinds of problems that we think that AI will enable us to solve in the future. On the topic of structure, I think that when you are picking a structure, like structure should follow mission. Right? You start with what is the thing that I want to do? What is the problem I want to solve? What is the impact I want to have in the world? And then you basically go down a decision tree of like, is this something that I can do in a for-profit setting? Am I building a product? Right? Is this something that people will pay for? If not, is this something where there's like really like an educational component, right? In which case academia might be a good fit because academia, the fundamental mission in academia is to educate students, right? The focused research organizations are a great solution for the kinds of problems that do not have, that need to be in a kind of that aren't a good fit in the for-profit setting, but that also like require more than what you typically get in like an educational setting, like more expertise, people who have more training than what you typically get in an educational setting. But I think that that's like the real thing to just always be focused on is like rather than the structure, just the mission, right? So a couple good reasons, just on that point, a couple good reasons like why I think some of us here have thought about alternative structures, right? Like number one, because you're not building a product. So FutureHouse we're nonprofit. We're nonprofit because we're not building a product. Like our goal is to solve science. Now along the way, like obviously if we solve science, there'll be lots of things that you could do that would be products, right? You'll have like lots of leverage in terms of making new drugs and things like that. But if you are in a for-profit structure, you often get tempted by kind of baubles along the way that can end up being like dead ends, right? You want to make sure that you go further. Being in the nonprofit setting allows you to in many cases, can allow you to go further, stay focused on like the end goal without getting distracted in one way or another. And that's kind of what we try to do at FutureHouse, just try to stay focused on the really, really big problems. As Scott was saying, the problems that are like, if we could do this, it would be, what was the word you used? Civilization altering. Or
civilizational infrastructure, yeah, civilizational altering.
Yeah, exactly, civilization altering. And not getting distracted by the kind of shorter term incentives along the way. So.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I think this also tees up we can open to discussion now this question. It seems like we maybe have some contrasting attitudes on this because we have here a fund which is interested in traditional capitalization for deep tech research ideas. Maybe on the other side of the room, we have some representation in terms of nonprofits. And in fact, even the sort of the nonprofit mechanism that you're working on, John, as well, that I think very intentionally decouples that funding from the sort of support, like the intellectual support for founders. So I'd be curious to hear, what is your belief about the influence of capital, of private capital, on the direction of these projects? And do you feel like, sort of what's the gap between these?
I mean, I can take a first stab at this. Like in my mind, it's a pipeline, and so there are definitely going to be problems where you're devising a new technology and it's unclear whether it'll be a product. And I think for a lot of those cases, an FRO or that kind of funding mechanism makes a lot of sense. But I think there's so much low-hanging fruit that we're just not doing for lack of people wanting to do it. Like I think there's so many things that are civilizationally altering and are functionally kind of like one weird trick. Like you take enough laptop batteries and you add wheels and you get a car, and it just takes enough people trying to do that, and you get a Tesla and an electric car ecosystem out the other side. And so I think, or even you take enough gaming GPUs and you run 1980s neural networks on it, and you get massive performance gains. And I think these are things that they require some ingenuity, some conviction, and the results can be really outsized, civilization-bending outcomes for humanity. And that's the area where I think being part of 50 years makes a lot of sense for someone, because it doesn't require fundamental new discoveries. We don't know how to solve science with AI right now. And so that should probably be an FRO. But for a lot of other things, we really do kind of know how to do, but no one's bothered to try. Or they've tried, but they've only taken it 50% of the way there because that was enough to get a paper accepted. And so that's the role I think private investors like 50 can play in an ecosystem like this.
I think the funding stack in for-profit investment is just larger. And so if you can build a for-profit with a product that you think will change the world, build a for-profit with a product you think you change the world, you'll get more funding for it. There are projects that are just fundamentally public goods that you can't capture value for, in which case you have to build a nonprofit. So we're building a big data set that is mapping the pharmome. So it's taking a bunch of FDA-approved drugs, screening them against human druggable targets, open sourcing the whole data set. This data set will be really important for actually training models on how drugs interact with gene targets. It'll discover a bunch of secondary use cases. It may discover a bunch of side effects. You can't build a company that does that. But there are potentially a lot of companies that can spin off from that, and those should be for profit.
The other thing is that capital is highly diverse, right? I mean, you can go and you can find, if you have an idea and it's like this idea will not generate any value, like any tangible value for 30 years, right? Well, you can go and you can find investors who might be on board with that. I mean, at the extreme, if you have your own money, you can just invest it in your own company, and then you don't have to ever, you can just run it however you want, right? But if you have something that's not going to return any value for 30 years, I would be a little bit hesitant about taking it from kind of mainstream VCs who have funds with 10-year lifetimes, et cetera. But I think there's a lot of capital that's very diverse.
Yeah, I think, much of the incentive structures are set up in a way where it leads to kind of more short-term thinking, especially around kind of investment and everything. I think, and this is maybe one of the potential promises of kind of being that nonprofit, is that it's not so much that you're not thinking about, hey, I just never want to make profit. It's just more of it allows you to think more on a much longer time scale. Right? I mean, instead of how do we make our numbers next quarter or next year? I mean, that's, it's kind of goes back to there's the apocryphal story of there is a lake and there's fish in the lake, and every year you can fish 90% of the fish and they come back, and you can do that in perpetuity, or you can fish 100% of the lake. The fish are now extinct and now there's no more, right? And so the capitalist answer to that is, well, of course you fish 100% of the lake, and you do it as fast as possible. And next year you go to another lake and another lake, right? And that's, I mean, that's, you know, if you look at it in the near term, it's like, oh, well, that's kind of like the optimal thing to do. You look at it in the long term, it's like, okay, well, of course that's stupid. Like you shouldn't do that. But so many times that the incentive structures are set up in a way such that, you know, it forces you to, you know, forces entrepreneurs and others, you know, people who want to build on these things to kind of think in this kind of near term and not in that long term. I mean, so I did my PhD at Stanford. I was, you know, an undergrad at MIT. And I mean, if you think about these, and like, you know, so those are some institutions that, you know, they don't, you know, the board of directors there, I mean, just theoretically, they are thinking about not in the course of like, well, how can we get more students to apply next year? How can we, you know, improve our numbers? They're thinking in the terms of decades, right? And like, we're, you know, and this is true at Berkeley as well, and like many other those great institutions. The ones that have stood the test of time and continue to be kind of, you know, like the way that they do the calculation is they say how we want to be the beacon where all the best people in the world want to come here and want to work. Right, you know, work on these interesting problems. And the way that they do that is not trying to explicitly like monetize those in the near term like they would if they were, you know, a Wall Street corporation. But if you look at like, you know, Stanford or Harvard, any of these, if they were for-profit corporations, they would be, you know, Fortune 50 or something. I mean, they would, like, you look at the size of the endowments, the amount of the influence they have and power that they have, they were able to kind of build these type of institutions, even though they are, you know, nonprofits on those sides. So I think it's very possible to build things like, and I think the biggest contrast there is that too many times, like, you know, not always, there are for-profit corporations that have had that kind of impact, but many times it forces you to short-term thinking, whereas like many of these problems that like the fundamental challenges we're trying to solve are like, you know, we need to be thinking in a much more long-term way.
Oh, but I do think, sorry, can I push back on that? I do think that the short-term versus long-term and nonprofit versus for-profit are like not exactly, like they're not exactly analogous, right? Because like it also depends in your nonprofit, like nonprofit funding is highly diverse,
yep.
right? So if you are going after grants, you damn well better have a lot of short-term outputs. Now those short-term outputs don't have to be revenue.
That's right.
But you damn well better have a bunch of short-term outputs. And like, you know, similarly, if you're in a for-profit at like, you know, X, right, Google X, right? Like you may have a longer horizon for innovation than at many different nonprofits that are funded like via shorter term mechanisms. The key, and in fact, I do think that like a mistake that many nonprofits make is like getting funding and just like assuming that because they have funding, like they will have a long runway and they have a long time to produce outputs, and then like but people lose interest and then it dries up.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, the actual fundamental like innovations, they happen from people who are, you know, staying up late at night working really hard, and so like that part doesn't, like you have to you know maintain that kind of pressure and intensity while also. And I think I agree that there's like, I mean, there's plenty of nonprofits that honestly they just don't go anywhere. They don't really have a big impact. And then and you see that today. I mean, what most of the great you know, innovation stuff, it's not happening in research labs anymore. I mean, it's not happening in academia. Most of it is happening in industry because like they're actually making those investments, and some of them are long-term investments.
Professor McClelland, I think you have a point.
Yeah, I just wanted to reflect on the fact that it doesn't feel to me like most of the real stakeholders are involved in the conversation. I think about, you know, the people of the United States, of whom all of us here represent, you know, the top 1/10 of 1% in terms of educational accomplishment and achievement. And I think about, you know, the concentration of both intellectual and monetary capital in this area, this conversation, this university, these corporations right here. You know, there are some politicians in America, but there are also countries where the public interest and the private and academic sectors are a little bit more, all three of them in play than I see in this context. So in Canada, I'm not an expert on Canada, but my feel and impression from the CFAR Institute and its relationship to other institutes that have been created there is that these really are partnerships between the large business interests, the government, and the academic sector. And it's a three-way partnership that has a greater potential to taking the broader interest into its purview. And I sort of promote some of our own politicians who think in this broader way about bringing, those other stakeholders in. So organizations that I think represent those stakeholders aren't being talked about here. Let me put a couple of them in front of you guys. Organizations like REI or Consumer Reports, which are, owned by the consumers, right? The stakeholders who want the products that are produced and not by the people who are going to make money from it. That's yet another model that I myself have been interested in trying to promote as well. So I'd be super interested in what everybody on this panel has to say about those kinds of things. But I just feel like we've got a slightly constrained search space when we're thinking just about the capitalists and the academic institutions.
Yeah, I'll bite. So I do love the idea of citizens as equity owners in the country that they live in, and politicians as even larger equity holders of the cities and states and so on that they're responsible for shepherding. That seems good. And when I look empirically at the kinds of integrated public-private, nonprofit, configuration space that has occurred, it's not been a very promising one for economic outputs and for producing innovations. And like even as we were having this conversation, you think of Europe, who started with the steam engine and had the potential to ramp into all of the technological revolutions to follow, and most of it happened here instead. And those kinds of public-private, nonprofit partnerships turn into vitocracies, where risk is avoided and optics are prioritized, and it ends up not producing. I was thinking about, well, how broken is it really? We had attention is all you need coming from Google. We had AlphaFold coming from Google. I had a lot of things that you would count as these amazing innovations coming from sort of private sector investments and things that were very long-term horizons. And I don't know, it's an open question. I do think that there is a real problem to be solved around people, around concentration of wealth, concentration of power, not having enough stakeholder involvement. But I think maybe the means of solving that has to do more with equity ownership by citizens and by government officials and so on, and then by the kind of private-public hybridizations that have happened in previous failed empires, basically.
Interesting. I'll talk to you more about that offline.
Sounds good.
I will say that, so as a nonprofit, we're owned by the public, and I would think of us neither as academic nor as a private institution, and that almost all of our projects are relying on partnerships with academic labs and partnerships with for-profit companies. If we're doing things like innovating on mass spec technology, we can't do that without the people who build mass specs. And so there is actually just an inherent partnership between the three different types of organizations as we're moving forward.
The National Institute of Health is an example in America of a institution which, directly contributes to health research, as well as, funding academics and academic corporate consortia to do clinical trials, et cetera. And, I do feel like it's probably a consequence of the sort of the idea that government should intrinsically be as small as possible, that we don't have as much of a federally sort of encouraged and supported, but that's my kind of progressive attitudes, I suppose, which hopefully will be sustained in the next election.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at innovations like, the internet and coming from and many other examples of those where kind of there was kind of governmental support there as well, and they were instrumental. That I have certainly seen this kind of where we're kind of in a lull in this area. We've been kind of just like continuing on, just based on some of the investments that we've made in the past. We haven't not been continuing to make those kind of investments at that level. It's largely been supplanted by some of the larger organizations like Google and Meta and et cetera, like that have actually been pushing those forward. But I do think that there's some kind of fundamental misalignments when there's when they're there, that will kind of lead to just a decline in progress or the type of progress that we want to see. So yeah, I think that certainly. I mean, I think all government, nonprofits or kind of NGOs as well as as the for-profit sector all has a place in here.
I think on that note, maybe in the last 10 minutes or so, we'd like to open up to you all in the audience. We've already got some eager questions, which is great, but we have the brain trust here. You should definitely take advantage of the debate. Okay, yes, in the back.
Good, we have a microphone. Hi, my name is Danilo Tomanovic. This is wonderful. All of you here today presenting a really incredible, I would say, frame. Although, in listening to you, I couldn't help but remember Alvin and Heidi Toffler. So they were futurists that were hired by Ronald Reagan to basically explain what would happen in the future. And the thing that's actually quite strange is that we're living in it right now. So I would encourage you to read the books, The Third Wave, Future Shock, Revolutionary Wealth. The reason why there's a little bit of confusion with everyone, I believe, in reading Toffler's work is we're in this moment where the incentives are misaligned. And actually, what's required is collaborative cooperation amongst all of you. Although, of course, my favorite is actually this gentleman on the far right, or far left, I suppose, because I subscribe to the same mindset. We have to protect what we have here in the United States, and we have mechanisms that work, that don't work elsewhere. But it's not the final answer. And that requires empathy, it requires insight, a little bit of wisdom, so I'm glad to see that we have a gentleman here that represents that. But that's really all I wanted to share with you today.
Great. Thank you. Let's see if you can look in the audience.
Question, and I can just do this. So yeah, Anastasia, thank you so much for talking through the kind of mission of Convergent research. I was wondering, so given this this like good problem formulation for an FRO, do you wait for people to come to you with ideas, or do you have a way of identifying people being more kind of proactive or searching about it?
It's a little of both. There's an open call for abstracts on the website, but I think we spend a lot of time doing sort of a random walk through people we trust, people who have good opinions, and saying, hey, again, what is the biggest bottlenecks in your field? Do any of your bottlenecks look like this shape? Who else should we speak to? I think that actually the drug screening project that I mentioned was found this way. There is a PI at UNC who has been trying to fund this project in his lab in a variety of ways for the last 10 years and could not get it funded. And so by talking to him about some of his other projects, he proposed this idea. Then we went out and we helped find the CEO, Bill Busa, bring in the founding team, and then find funders. And so we do a lot of proactive searching. Sometimes I think of us as a venture creation studio as much as we are sort of a supporter of these organizations.
I have a follow-up question about that. Do you use quantitative models for evaluating the positive externalities of ideas and having, because we should have a public list of like idea, funding amount, positive externality estimation, and we can collapse it over time or expand it as we get more information?
We don't have a quantitative model for a couple of reasons. I am hesitant to fall into the category of thinking about things so much that you don't do things, which I think is
we should talk. We have a quant one we use at 50.
Okay.
That there are certain things we don't do because they don't fit in our shape, but they might fit in yours. But we can use the same model. So I would be happy to share it with you.
That sounds great. I will say that the way that we kind of approximate this is this notion of being core to the trunk of the tech tree.
Yeah.
So I think we're unlikely to work on something that is a leaf, something where the product is right on the other side of it. But again, this drug screening project, as an example, this data set will spin off a bunch of other companies and a bunch of other research, and it is pretty core to like the trunk of the tree in the data set sense, or the math project. Math is you could say that it is the root of the tree. And so trying to find these projects that have many, many unknown downstream effects, hopefully like robustly positive effects. We do a little bit of like thinking about differential technology development and trying to find like robustly safe projects to work on.
That's great. The core is, I don't know, just say one more thing and raise your hands if you have questions, feel free to interrupt. But the core question that we've had to answer for ourselves is, how do you value a hypothetical technology? And if I could offer you faster data transmissions by a factor of 10, or an immunotherapy that is more likely to be accepted by 40% of the population, or a new impulse engine for space travel, and each of them has these three costs, which one do you buy? And like being able to answer that question for getting to more efficient resource allocation, both as investors and funders, but also as people. Like when you're a young, highly promising scientist, you could choose what to work on with your career. I feel like most of it is you do like local neighborhood search of the PhD supervisors in a couple of universities, and then you get there and you spend 3 weeks thinking about an idea, and then 15 years in a career trajectory where you then later learn whether or not it was impactful at all. And I think we really need to play with those ratios a little bit, and we could get to a much more optimal point on Pareto frontier.
I see some emerging counterpoints or perhaps continuations, but I think we're probably out of time. And so if you would join me in thanking the panelists for joining us today.